Hello, this video is going to go over Chapter 22, Objective 5, which is the process of oxygen and carbon dioxide transport within the respiratory system. So let's first talk about the hemoglobin molecule. The hemoglobin molecule is made up of 4 polypeptide chains. Now these are protein chains. 2 of those are called alpha chains, 2 of those are called beta chains. And then there's a heme group that contain 4 irons. So each one of these chains, so this red one here, this orange one here, pink, and then kind of the maroon, each one of these is one of those polypeptide chains. You can see you've got beta chain number 1, beta chain number 2, alpha chain number 1, alpha chain number 2. And within each of those polypeptide chains, there is a heme group. So there are a total of 4 irons in that hemoglobin molecule. You can see that iron right there. So this is that heme group, which is kind of represented by this disc right here with that dark red center. That's representing the iron ion. So where does oxygen bind in that hemoglobin molecule? Well, it binds to the iron. So you can see right here that heme group is represented by a square. You've got the iron atom in the center, and that is where oxygen is going to bind. And when the oxygen binds, what happens is that hemoglobin molecule actually changes shape. You can see here this oxygen attached to that iron, and it's going to cause that heme molecule to change shape. So hemoglobin forms an unstable reversible bond with oxygen. So we like that because that way oxygen can bind as it's traveling through the bloodstream, but then it can easily be offloaded to the tissues. So we like that oxygen is not a stable bond, so that way it's easy to come and go. In its oxygen-loaded form, it is called oxyhemoglobin, and the blood is going to be a bright red color because of that. When there's no oxygen bound, it's called deoxyhemoglobin, and then that blood is going to have a purplish-bluish tinge to it because of the coloration of the difference between oxygen versus deoxygenated. You can see here that deoxygen, that heme that does not have the oxygen attached, that deoxyhemoglobin, notice it's a darker color. With oxyhemoglobin, it's a brighter red. Hemoglobin not only binds to oxygen, hemoglobin can also bind to carbon dioxide. And when that happens, when the carbon dioxide binds to the hemoglobin molecule, it's called carbaminohemoglobin. There's also something called carboxyhemoglobin. This is actually when carbon monoxide is attached. Carbon monoxide is the result of you having a combustion reaction with not enough oxygen present. It would be like running a car inside of a closed garage, and that will have a result of increased carbon monoxide as a product. And carbon monoxide loves to bind to the hemoglobin molecule, more so than the others actually. It has a high affinity. So if you look right here, hemoglobin's affinity for carbon monoxide is 200 times its affinity for oxygen. So what that means is, if your hemoglobin molecule has a choice of binding to carbon monoxide or oxygen, it's going to pick carbon monoxide. And here's the thing, if hemoglobin is bound to carbon monoxide, it can't bind to oxygen, which means your body cannot transport oxygen because carbon monoxide is stuck to it. So these are just some effects of carbon monoxide poisoning. You can see that it can be fatal. So that's why there's carbon monoxide detectors that they make for you to put in your house, because this can be something that is pretty serious. This is just showing you where that oxygen binds, where the carbon dioxide binds, and then where the carbon monoxide binds. Now actually, carbon dioxide doesn't really bind to the iron part. It binds to the hemoglobin itself, but that's okay. So hemoglobin, like we said a second ago, has a high affinity to things you don't want it to bind to. These are all things you don't want to be carrying around in your body. So hemoglobin would rather bind to carbon monoxide, cyanide, sulfur monoxide, nitrogen monoxide, also known as nitric acid, and hydrogen sulfide. So we'd rather bind to these instead of oxygen. So if those are available, that means hemoglobin's going to bind to that, not bind to oxygen, which means your body is not getting the oxygen that it needs. So now there's this, in your packet, you've got a handout there that will go over this Armando Hasudigan video that you can certainly follow along with if you'd like. So there's a handout in there for respiration and gas exchange. We're going to go ahead and take a look at this. You've also got this in your packet as well. It says at the top, Chapter 22, Objective 5, Gas Exchange, how oxygen enters the tissues. So we're going to pause the PowerPoint here, and we're going to do a little drawing. So you should have this packet here, this page in your packet. So let's kind of take a look and see what we're doing. You should remember, I hope, let me get my little pens out, you should remember this drawing up here at the top. So we've already talked about that. Now we're dealing with how oxygen is going to enter the tissues. So our focus for this page is what's happening down here. This is where oxygen is entering the tissues at in our drawing, if you remember that. Now there's two ways that oxygen can get to the tissues. Here's the other thing to know about oxygen. Oxygen is not very soluble in blood. And remember, blood has a high concentration of water there. So oxygen does not like to hang out in the blood very much. So what we have here is, to kind of show you what's going on here, we've got our tissues right here. Okay, just kind of showing you what our picture looks like. I'm going to tilt this back a little bit. There we go. And right here, you have your systemic capillary. So your systemic capillary carries blood. This has a high oxygen content. Your bodies in the tissue have a low oxygen content. So the purpose of your capillary is to take the oxygenated blood and drop it off in the tissues. But how does it do that? Again, there's two ways we get the oxygen from the capillary into the tissues. So the first way, making sure y'all can see that. Remember we said oxygen doesn't really like to just hang out in the plasma. It's too much water there, it really doesn't like to do that. But there is some. So some of the oxygen is dissolved in the plasma and passes directly into the tissues. Keep in mind, this is just going to be straight diffusion, because it's going from an area of high oxygen concentration to an area of low oxygen concentration. So this right here is number 1. It's showing you you've got oxygen dissolved in the plasma. Notice this little arrow right here. See how it's small? This is letting you know there's not a lot of oxygen that's going to do that. It's going to pass through the interstitial fluid and enter directly into the cells of the tissue. Now, the next method, we said there were 2. So the other method here, how we get the oxygen from the capillary into the tissues, is going to be most of this oxygen. The oxygen is bound to a hemoglobin molecule. And remember, we called when oxygen is bound to a hemoglobin molecule oxyhemoglobin, and that's going to be that bright red color. And I'm going to try to scoot that back just a little bit there so you guys can see. And it breaks down into hemoglobin and oxygen. So that oxyhemoglobin, basically the oxygen breaks apart, and so you're left with just a hemoglobin molecule, and the oxygen will pass out of the red blood cell into the tissues. So this is going to be number 2 right here. It's going to detach from the hemoglobin molecule within the red blood cell. That oxygen, see that big arrow? That means a lot of this is going to pass this direction, or use this method to get into the tissues. Now that the oxygen is in the tissues, either just diffusion straight from the plasma into the tissues or detaching from the hemoglobin molecule and getting into the tissues, what happens next? Why are we trying to get oxygen into the tissues? What's the whole point there? If you remember the tissues, this cell right here, okay, it contains mitochondria. Remember, it kind of looks like a little football here. So that's our mitochondria within the cells, and you've got a bunch of little mitochondria within the cells, by the way. There's not just one, there's a bunch of them in there. And in the mitochondria, it is going to undergo cellular respiration. So it's going to take sugar, C6H12O6, glucose specifically, plus that oxygen gas that just arrived, and convert that into waste products, carbon dioxide plus water plus ATP, that form of energy. And that tissue cell, that cell is now going to have energy to do whatever it needs to do. So that's the purpose why we even need the oxygen in the first place. And if this was like a skeletal muscle cell or something like that, you're going to very much need that oxygen gas so you can make the ATP in order for your skeletal muscles to move. So that's the whole point of why we need to get oxygen into the tissues in the first place. We'll talk about this carbon dioxide that's building up in those tissues and how we're going to get rid of that here in just a second. So I do want to give you the formula, basically the formula, for what's happening here with number 2. Like, I wrote it out in words, but let's go ahead and kind of write down what's happening here. So we've got our oxyhemoglobin, which is going to break down into hemoglobin plus oxygen gas. So this is our chemical formula as to what's going on. So I wanted to make sure you knew that in case you see that again. Now, let's take a look at our next page, and I'll upload these as well. Let's take a look at our next page here and see how we get carbon dioxide entering the blood. Just to kind of show you where we are, we're right here. We talked about this piece where oxygen gets into the tissues. Now we're going to talk about this piece right here, how carbon dioxide enters into the blood. So we said we had that buildup of carbon dioxide from the breakdown of glucose and oxygen, right? Just letting you know again that here's our tissue. And this has a high concentration of waste that has been building up. And then in our systemic capillary here, we have a low concentration of carbon dioxide as it's coming down. So how do we get the waste from the tissue into the capillary so that it can go back to the heart and out through the lungs when you exhale? So how do we get the carbon dioxide from the tissues into the capillary? So let's take a look at it. There's actually 4 ways that this happens. So our first probably going to run out of room on this one. Our first way that we're going to talk about, some of the carbon dioxide is going to come from the tissue and will diffuse, again, go from high concentration to low concentration, directly into the plasma. So what we're looking at here is that right there. This is number one. And when I say some, we're going to say about 10% of all the carbon dioxide that's going to move is going to move in this method. It's going to just go simple diffusion straight from the tissues into the plasma. Notice it didn't go into the red blood cell, it's just hanging out in the plasma in the blood. That's our first scenario there. Now, let's take a look at the second way. Remember we said there were 4 ways, so let's take a look at number 2. So we're going to flip our page. And this is a little bit different of a picture here. This is just a continuation, just a little bit different of a picture here. We've already discussed number 1 right here, which is carbon dioxide going straight into the plasma, and we said this was 10%, so that was method number 1. Let's take a look at method number 2. So we have got carbon dioxide enters the plasma and reacts with the water in the plasma to form a bicarbonate ion. Now I'm going to go ahead and give you the formula for bicarbonate. It is HCO3 minus 1. That's the formula for the bicarbonate ion. And hydrogen gas. Now, this is a very slow reaction. There's no enzyme involved. So let's take a look at where this is going to be represented in our picture up here. So we're going to have this situation right here. This is number 2. So let me kind of give you the formula for this. I know it's written up there, but let me go ahead and kind of write it out. So we have carbon dioxide plus the water in the plasma is going to form your bicarbonate ion plus some hydrogen ions. And this happens in the plasma, and this is slow. Now, I'm not going to worry about that hydrogen and what's going on there, so we're not going to worry too much about that. This has this intermediate step right here, so we're not going to worry about that. So that's basically the reaction that we're looking at here, okay? Now, let's take a look at number 3. Going to get a little different color here to work with. I don't know if y'all will even be able to tell that it's a different color. I kind of got a little bluish color there. Okay, so the third way that we're going to take a look at, and this is going to sound super familiar. We have carbon dioxide enters the red blood cell. So in number 2, we have it entering the plasma, but in number 3, we have it actually going into the red blood cell and reacts with water to form, sounds awful familiar, right? Bicarbonate, which is HCO3 minus 1, and hydrogen. Now, the thing with this is, the same reaction is happening, but instead of it happening in the plasma, it is happening inside the red blood cell. And notice the thickness of the arrow. This is going to let us know that this is going to be the most prominent way carbon dioxide is going to travel through the bloodstream. So we have the carbon dioxide passing through the tissues, passing out of the tissues, and it is going to undergo this reaction right here. So this is number 3. Notice that carbon dioxide goes into the red blood cell, reacts with the water inside the red, there's water inside the red blood cell too, to form your bicarbonate ion and your hydrogen ions. I do want to go ahead and write the formula down here for you guys. So we have carbon dioxide plus water forms your bicarbonate ion, HCO3 minus 1, plus some hydrogen gas. Now, again, like we said, this happens in the red blood cell, and this is a very fast reaction. So if you notice right on top of this arrow right here, it says it's fast, where the other one, where it happens in the plasma, it says it's slow. So what is the difference? Why is the one that happens inside the red blood cell the fast one, and the one in the plasma is not fast? So what's going on there? It's fast because there's an enzyme there's an enzyme inside the red blood cell which allows this reaction to proceed faster, called carbonic anhydrase. So that's the name of that enzyme. You're going to need to know that enzyme, and you can see it right up here. There's the name of that enzyme right there. And again, that's what allows it to be fast, is that presence of that enzyme. See, there's no enzyme in the plasma, so that's why this reaction number 2, same reaction, went slower. Again, enzymes speed up chemical reactions. Now, we also have another situation going on here that we need to talk about, and that's called chloride shift. So what is chloride shift? Notice we have this bicarbonate ion right here, which has a -1 charge. So the chloride shift is when bicarbonate, HCO3 minus 1, that's a big deal, switches places with the chloride ion, which is Cl minus 1, outside the red blood cell. So, it's going to get a little messy here. That bicarbonate is going to switch places with the chloride ion outside of the red blood cell. So we have right up here this bicarbonate. It's going to switch places with the chloride ion, and that is what's called chloride shift. So if you're losing a -1 charge, so that's what's happening. That bicarbonate ion is leaving the red blood cell, so we're going to have increase in negative charges outside the red blood cell, but to maintain equilibrium, a negative charge is going to enter the red blood cell. So there's no net change in charge. That is your chloride shift. So In reality, what we have here is we have this bicarbonate ion that is now present inside the plasma from the fast reaction. But if you remember, we also have the bicarbonate ion from the slow reaction. Remember, carbon dioxide reacted with water to form that bicarbonate ion. So we have a high concentration of bicarbonate ions floating in the plasma, and that's important, okay? What that means is, if you have a lot of bicarbonate ions, this is going to increase the pH of the blood. So blood that has a high, I should say maybe a low oxygen content versus a high carbon dioxide content. If it's got a high carbon dioxide content, it's due to the fact that that carbon dioxide is traveling through the blood in the form of this bicarbonate ion now, which is going to increase your pH. Now, about 70% of your carbon dioxide is going to travel in the form of that bicarbonate ion. So it's either going to be from the combination of the carbon dioxide reacting with the water in the plasma and the carbon dioxide reacting with the water inside the red blood cell. This is how 70% of that carbon dioxide is going to transport through the blood, ultimately in the form of this bicarbonate ion. And you can see the majority of that is coming from the fast reaction. Okay, I'm not going to ask you to know how much specifically. And we said there were 4 ways. So what is the 4th way? This one's a little bit more rare, not quite as prominent as the other ways. See if I can bring my paper up there so you can see. I know I'm running out of room here, so let's take a look at number 4 here. So we have carbon dioxide, enters the red blood cell and binds to hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide doesn't really like to do this, but it will do it. Again, it would rather bind to oxygen, but you know, if carbon dioxide's in the location, it'll bind to the hemoglobin molecule inside the red blood cell to form. Remember what we said, carbon dioxide and hemoglobin combined form carb amino hemoglobin. So your reaction would be carbon dioxide plus hemoglobin produces carb amino hemoglobin. Now about 20%, that's totaling 100 now, that 20% of the carbon dioxide is going to actually work in this method. So you have right here carbon dioxide in the plasma. It's going to come over here, enter into the red blood cell, bind to the hemoglobin molecule to form that carb amino hemoglobin. So this is method number 4. Those are your 4 methods by which carbon dioxide can travel, enter into the bloodstream, and then travel through the bloodstream. Now all of this is in your PowerPoint. It's in the PowerPoint there that we looked at. Oh gosh darn it, I don't like it when it does that. There we go. So we talked about the 2 methods that oxygen enters the tissues. We talked about what's happening with cellular respiration. We've talked about the 4 ways that carbon dioxide leaves the tissues and enters into the bloodstream. This goes through each one of those, so this does happen in the PowerPoint as well. This information is here. We talked about chloride shift. We talked about the last method by which carbon dioxide enters into the blood. You do need to know your relationship of gases. So So we talked just a second ago about how an increase in pH is going to be alkaline. Okay, that's going to be a more basic situation here. And take a look right here. This is that bicarbonate ion. So when you have a high bicarbonate ion, that's going to result in a high pH. Now, remember, the majority of that carbon dioxide was actually in the form of that bicarbonate ion. So it's not traveling as true carbon dioxide. So that's why that is decreased right there. So you do need to know your relationship of your gases. I just kind of put this on here just so you can kind of see what's going on and remember what we have previously said. Here's the other reaction, so I will let you take a look at that and make sure you have that understanding of the relationship of your gases and pH and the words basic and acidic. Now, when we're talking about pulmonary capillaries gas exchange, this is happening in the lungs, okay? This is the exact same stuff we just talked about. You can see the alveolus right here. This is the lung, and this is the plasma. So how do we just got our carbon dioxide loaded into our blood. How does the blood get rid of the carbon dioxide, get it into the lungs, and so you can exhale it? And by reverse, how does that oxygen that's in the lungs, because you just inhale, taking in a bunch of oxygen, and that blood coming in is going to be low in oxygen, so how is that oxygen going to get from the lungs to the blood? They are the exact opposite reactions that we just talked about. So I'm not going to go through and draw all these again, but you can real quickly kind of take a look at this. Some oxygen is going to go straight from the alveoli directly into the plasma and travel that way, but again, that's not the most. Remember, it doesn't really care to do that. The majority of that oxygen is going to be attached to that hemoglobin molecule called oxyhemoglobin. Now, how is that carbon dioxide that we loaded in the blood, how are we going to get it out of the blood into the lungs so you can exhale and get rid of it? The exact opposite for reactions that we just talked about. So some, very little, was actually traveling as carbon dioxide as dissolved plasma in the dissolved plasma. So you have these handouts as well. So this right here is just carbon dioxide dissolved, going from high concentration to low concentration, and then get into that lung. So about 10% is going to go that way. Remember, we had bicarbonate that was in the plasma, which is going to be a slow reaction, and this one is not shown in this picture here, but it would be the bicarbonate ion that's going to be dissolved in the plasma. It is going to then enter and turn into carbon dioxide and water in the alveoli. This again, not pictured, but that is a slow reaction. Now you have this reaction here, which is where that bicarbonate ion is going to combine with that hydrogen to form carbon dioxide and water, and that carbon dioxide is then going to go into the alveoli. Again, the majority of the bicarbonate ion turning back into carbon dioxide, that's going to be about 70%. And the reason why this is fast is because that carbonic anhydrase is there. Don't forget, you also have a chloride shift that is involved in this. So you've got to get the bicarbonate from the plasma back into the blood, back into the blood cell, and that's going to be bicarbonate's going to come in, chloride will then go out. So that bicarbonate is going to shift places with the chloride to reverse what we just talked about. Now, number 4, the other method was we've got some of that carbon dioxide, about 20%, attached to that hemoglobin molecule. That's going to dissociate, and that carbon dioxide will then go into the alveoli. Again, about 20% is going to go that way. So it is the exact opposite of what we were talking about. So this is just a summary slide here showing you from if you look at the movement of the carbon dioxide here, you can see this is the tissues offloading the waste into the blood, and then here you can see the blood rich in carbon dioxide offloading it into the lungs so that you can exhale. And that concludes objective 5.